Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real privilege to be here today. I have to say, I'm just stunned by the turnout. The last time I saw this many people was when my obituary was mistakenly printed. So thank you very much. Let me see if we can get the technology working here. There we go. That's just some of the letters. What this really means, according to my wife, is that you just have to use more ink on your business card. So I'd like to begin with a little warning, if I could. The presentation is going to present some information which could be disturbing or generate disturbing questions. And I also want to warn you that it contains extremely dry humor, which could appear almost anywhere in the presentation. I just want to also go on record as saying that I do not have any conflicts of interest with respect to today's topic. I do, from time to time, consult with multiple governments, nonprofit organizations, and so forth, none of which have involvement in today's topic. I wouldn't be a very good dean if I didn't just spend a couple of moments introducing you to the Faculty of Health. For those who may not be entirely aware, the Faculty of Health is our second largest faculty and has 9,200 undergraduate students and about 600 graduate students. We have in the neighborhood of 165 faculty members. What people really don't understand is how outstanding our programs are. We don't typically think about York as a hotbed for health. But in fact, our psychology program has consistently been rated by independent reviewers in the top 100 programs in the world. And when you think that there are roughly 15,000 such programs, being in the top 100 isn't bad. Our KIN program is rated number 23 in the world. Again, pretty darn impressive when you think of all of the universities in the world. Our nursing program is among the most comprehensive in the world and unique in the way that it offers different programs in things like the global health aspects of nursing, community nursing, mental health are some of the unique areas, along with child development and on and on. Our health studies, health policy programs, health informatics, health management programs, again, really highly respected. In fact, our critical disabilities program, even though it's not part of a particular independent ranking that we can find, is largely acknowledged to be certainly in the top 3 in the world and highly influential with organizations such as the United Nations. Our global health program is at the undergraduate level unique in Canada and described by Maclean's magazine as a real gem. It's not just the quality of our programs, the quality of our research, which in fact feeds into the quality of our programs. We have about 12% of all of the faculty on campus, but we generate 26% of all the research money that comes in. We have 12 research chairs, including 5 Canada Research Chairs, some of the most prestigious awards that are given to researchers for the quality of their work. We host one of 12 institutes from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and we have a variety of research centers that specialize in everything from global health, health and aging, vision science, muscle health, child development, etc. Again, all world-class researchers. So you can see why I'm proud to talk about it. What you probably can't understand is why they hired a rogue like me. But I think the real reason, Rebecca, that I was hired was that I promised not to mess with success too much. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why we're here primarily today. There's no question that technology has brought many benefits to society. However, we don't often really talk about the downside, what the costs are, what the full costs are of technology and its adoption. And I think that it's time we had that conversation, and that conversation goes beyond how many jobs it produces or displaces, whether it causes repetitive strain injury or not. I think there's a much fuller, richer conversation that has to take place. And so I'd like to just introduce one particular area today focused on the use of social media and cell phones, smartphones, and what impact it might be having on our health and well-being. So I'm not going to suggest that technology is good or bad, because in fact, there are elements of both. What I am going to suggest is that we do need to think about what the costs of technology are, and are we prepared for the challenges? Are we thinking about those challenges, and are we implementing strategies to mitigate the unintended consequences? So, little quiz. So, university, pop quiz. Surprise. All right, so just quietly now, I want you to think about improving how much have smartphones and social media improved our ability to communicate with friends and family and others. Get a sense? Yeah. They've improved our ability to make new friends. Yeah. Because of that, they have the capacity to reduce loneliness. Yeah. And this is sort of a giveaway. This is an indication of whether you actually read about today's talk prior to coming today. How many think that it actually ends up improving our health and our health care? Okay. So I'm going to come back to this slide at the end, and we'll see if you have the same perspectives when we're finished. So there are two common arguments that you hear continuously. Humans are social, that so much of our happiness and well-being depends on the ability to communicate and connect with one another. And given that social media, things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and a whole bunch of other stuff that I can't even pronounce, help people to communicate with one another, therefore, it must help our well-being and mental health. It only stands to reason. And that technology certainly creates wealth and jobs, which we know are important determinants of health. So why are we even having this discussion? Should be pretty straightforward. That's the common language. Now, I want to explain the history. This is a very recent phenomenon that we're talking about. The first mobile phone and internet were both developed in 1992. Now, that thing on the right, for those under the age of 30, is a mobile phone. And what doesn't come through is that this fantastic device was approximately the same size and weight as a brick. So there was no question at this point that in terms of our ability to work out, you could work out while being on the phone. Canada has played a major role, and I have had the privilege of meeting the co-founders of BlackBerry on many occasions, and they introduced their mobile internet device, or their ability to communicate and send email through this mobile device in 1998. The first smartphones began appearing in about 2002. The first iPhone, as you know from the big announcements this year out of Apple, have now been around 10 years. The first interactive games appeared about 2009. Social media, the first was something called MySpace. In 2003, Steve Zuckerberg and colleagues at Harvard developed a precursor around the same point in time, but actually then released Facebook for the first time in 2004. Twitter has been around since 2006, although some political figures now make it feel like it's been around a lot longer than that. And Instagram has been around since 2010, and these are still the dominant social media groups and organizations. In other words, social media, if you think about it, has only been around for less than 1/100% of human history. In all the time that we have been developing, they've only been around in a brief period of time. Now, having said that, we also need to know that this kind of technology is not new for everyone. If you're 26 years of age or under, you've never lived in a world where there hasn't been email. And most high school students today have never lived in a world where there hasn't been social media. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to focus quite a bit today on adolescence. This technology hasn't just appeared recently, it has just absolutely taken the world by storm. Facebook now has well over 1 billion users on the planet. 63% of Canadians use social media, the most common of which was Facebook, followed by Twitter and Instagram. The average Facebook user in Canada says that they have 300 Facebook friends. And the average smartphone user interacts with their phone an average of 85 times per day. That's once every 11 minutes they're awake. That's the average, folks. That means there's some people that use it a bit more often. What's interesting is that when you ask people to just subjectively indicate how often they use their phone, they give you an answer that is about half of what we know actually occurs. And 77% of Canadians have the belief that this kind of technology is really helpful in terms of communicating with other people. Now, among young people, 92% go online every single day. And 94% of 14 to 35-year-olds own a smartphone or have access to one. 63% of adolescents text every single day, and they send an average of 100 texts every day. My thumbs would fall off. 45% of adolescents use social media for an average of 2 hours every day, and that doesn't include email, and I'm assured by my son's email is just so yesterday. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is how that contrasts with the next line, which is just over 1/3 of adolescents have a face-to-face conversation with one of their friends after school. By the way, did you love this little, if you couldn't read the, yeah. I went back, actually, in our family photo album, and it turns out that about the last 10 years, this is exactly what my 2 sons look like. You know what they said? A while ago, we had them, they're growing now with their own families and so forth, but I remember at one point, as they were on their phones while they were still home, we called them for dinner. They said, and we finally got, my wife and I, quite upset because they weren't coming. And they said, well, you didn't send a text. Now, there's some other things that have been happening at the same time that you need to be aware of. So what we know is that in Canada, somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 adults or people over the course of their lifetime will experience some type of mental illness and distress. And that 70% And I want you to remember this throughout the talk. 70% of mental health issues have their onset in childhood or adolescence. In other words, to use an old analogy, they are very much the canary in the coal mine in terms of what we might be facing as a society. So there are a lot of very good reasons why we need to pay much more careful attention to our young people. And that mental disorders, it turns out, not only cost a whole bunch of money, but they dramatically increase your risk of not only dying prematurely, but of developing a whole series of conditions which can be quite debilitating. If you were to ask the average Canadian what the most common cause of death is among persons with mental illness, you would probably generally get it wrong. The most common cause are chronic illnesses like heart disease and cancer. At a much greater rate, by the way, than we see among those who have not had mental health issues. This is a problem that is happening not just in Canada, but we see the same thing happening in the United States. We see it happening in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, where I just spent 4 years, and on and on. And the ripple effect is affecting our schools. It is affecting workplaces. It is impacting us here at university as we increasingly are trying to find ways of helping students to cope with some significant and real challenges. It impacts on our justice system, and on when you think about it. So, what is the relationship then between well-being? In this case, we have a large sample from the United States, and what this group has been doing is tracking adolescent well-being since 1991. And what they found was that it was rising in the 90s, and then it peaked, and it was quite stable for quite a number of years up until 2011. And for reasons that we're just starting to think about, between 2012 and their recent results up to 2016, there have been dramatic declines in a sense of well-being. And what they found was the more screen time, the more social media, texting, electronic games, internet time, the greater the reduction. Now, there is an important caveat here, and that is that when teens spend less than 5 hours per week, less than an hour a day, that it actually had a very small improvement in their well-being. But once you get over that threshold, it seems to be correlated in a negative fashion with happiness. Now, that's a correlational thing. So let's look more deeply. What about relationship between texting and anxiety and life satisfaction in college students? Well, in this particular study of 1,000 college students, what we found is that both cell phone use and texting reduced life satisfaction and increased levels of anxiety. We go on. Here's a study that looked at the use of mobile phones, TV viewing, and they found that TV viewing had some association, but the greatest impact was on mobile phone use on levels of depression. And this was at a 1-year follow-up. So when they looked at baseline and then they followed up and they looked at history of media use, in particular mobile phone use, and after controlling for that initial level of depression, at the end what they found was the more time you spent, the more likely you were to be depressed. Now, what we now understand, and what's increasingly become open to the public, is that devices have been designed by experts specifically to become addictive, to make them very difficult to put down. It's not just the service that they provide in helping us connect with others, but there are various means of embedding things within the technology and the design of the software, which is designed specifically to activate the same neural pathways and a neurochemical called dopamine. And that same chemical and those same pathways are the same ones that we know are related to things like gambling and substance abuse. Why do they do it? Well, it's about money. The more time somebody spends online, the more ads you can sell. And shareholders at Apple, to their credit, recently started to push back and said, we're not quite sure that that's a good thing. They begin to realize that there are real risks, financial and reputational, in doing such things. So if we know that phone use and social media can become addictive, again, what is the impact in terms of psychological well-being and distress? And the answer is that among those who are deemed to be problematic users, that in this particular meta-analysis, takes all of the available studies, 23 in this particular case, that collectively examined 13,000 participants. And what they found was that about up to 10% of adolescents and young adults seem to have addiction-like symptoms associated with Facebook use, and that there was quite a substantial correlation between high levels of Facebook use and psychological distress, depression and anxiety specifically. As the use of Facebook goes down, life satisfaction and positive health went up. And as use went up, so did depression and anxiety. Quitting Facebook, does that do any good? So it's one thing to say that they're sort of correlated with one another, but is there any help on the horizon? And here, what we know from a Danish study is that when students were divided, young adults were divided into two groups. The group that stopped using Facebook, took a break from it, saw almost immediate improvements in levels of life satisfaction, happiness, and overall positive emotions. And again, what we saw was what's commonly called in medicine a dose response. The higher the use, the greater the net benefits from stopping. So these are just a selection of studies. There are more that are on the horizon. As you may have noticed with the dates, all of these studies basically have been done over the last 3 or 4 years because of how recent the use, and particularly the high prevalence of Facebook and smartphones have been. So, what are some explanations? Well, we're going to look at cyberbullying, reduced physical activity, loss of sleep, which then has an impact on everything from your immune system to your health and well-being and risk factors for chronic illness, etc. Face-to-face connection, what impact might it have there, and particularly on things like empathy and loneliness and isolation. So let's look at each of these in turn. So you may not realize that now 5% of Canadians report that they've been bullied online, including an astonishing 12% of adolescents. And this is after controlling for things like social economic status, bullying increases your odds of having poor mental health by 430%. Okay? It increases your odds of binge drinking by 290%, and drug use by 330%. Another study done in Saskatoon or throughout Saskatchewan, 10% of 9 to 14-year-olds reported being the victim of cyberbullying in the last month. Now, how many have been a parent or guardian of a teen recently? Yeah? So this is going to come as a complete shock to you. It turns out that between 2009 and 2013, problematic sleep patterns, which in adolescents are typically defined as 7 hours of sleep or less, has increased by 16%. And multiple studies have now shown that 25% of adolescents are engaged in screen-related activities after bedtime. 6% wake up to play online games, 15% wake up to send texts, 11% wake up to use social media. I know this is a shock, isn't it? If you've been a parent recently, this is coming as a shock to you. Maybe not so much. And here's the even bigger surprise. Teens that have access to social media have trouble falling asleep and waking up on time. And those who have sleep challenges, and this, I couldn't believe it when I saw this, you know, having raised 2 boys. When you have less sleep, they're more irritable. And they're moodier. Okay? How about this phenomena? You probably didn't even know it had a name. But when you snub others in favor of using your phone or other mobile devices, it's called snubbing, or fubbing, sorry. Okay? It's the use of your phone in the presence of others. And when you do that, it reduces your satisfaction and the level of the connectedness that you feel, and particularly in the person who is watching you do this. You feel unheard, disrespected. Even having a phone sitting out on a table during a discussion is enough to disrupt. Okay? People, interestingly enough, who are fubbed, guess what they do? Fubbing, we now know, reduces intimacy. It disrupts our ability to make eye contact, to read body posture, and to really understand and catch minute facial expressions that it turns out are absolutely essential for understanding and exercising empathy. Now, what's empathy? These 2 youngsters have kind of figured it out. Empathy is essentially the ability to understand and appreciate what somebody else may be feeling and thinking, and then the ability to respond in an appropriate way. When you get through all the jargon, it's all that it means. Now, a study of 13,000 US college students found that the levels of empathy have been dropping significantly since 2004. The opposite of empathism is narcissism, and that has been increasing. And I'll predict that one day soon, a Twitter addict will end up being elected, I don't know, US president. Now I want to exercise a little caution here. These are trends that are happening among our young people, but it does not mean that every young person is narcissistic or does not have high levels of empathic skills. So please don't run out of here making those kinds of generalizations. That would be very harmful and very wrong. What I'm pointing out is that there are certain trends across our population that we need to pay attention to. We need to own this problem as a society. So, what about Facebook? What work is there? Again, just one quick illustration, that Facebook use reduces, surprise, surprise, both empathy and life satisfaction. And when we do fancy statistical analysis, am I the only person here who really loves like major multivariable statistical analysis? Like when I'm thinking like logistic regression with multiple variables. How many people are like me? If you read a stats book before bedtime, you cannot go to sleep. Strangely, my wife finds this odd. No? I'm glad to know that there are some people who share my passion for multivariable analysis. Well, when we do all of those fancy statistical techniques, what it tells us is essentially that, yes, although they're sort of all interrelated, but it turns out that the reason that life satisfaction seems to go down is because empathy is undermined first. And when you find yourself in a position where you don't really understand or have the ability to understand how somebody else may be feeling or thinking, and then you lack the ability to provide, or you struggle with the ability to provide an appropriate response, that impacts on your life satisfaction as well. And it turns out that when you do that, and when you find yourself meeting people day after day that you just can't figure out, you feel very lonely in the world. Now, this is an interesting study that was published a few years ago. What they did was, it was a group that wanted to see if they could use Facebook to improve voter turnout in the US elections in 2010, or congressional elections, sorry. And all they did was they asked Facebook users, once you voted, to go home and simply put a note on your Facebook page that you had gone out to vote. Not who you voted for, just I went out and voted. To see if it would influence your friends or your Facebook friends in terms of going out and encouraging them to vote. And astonishingly, that simple little intervention produced an impact. It actually increased voter turnout by 340,000 people. Okay, now it's not a huge percentage, but an extra 340,000 people are more than a lot of candidates ever would have vote for them. So what's the hitch? When they dove down deeper and looked at the data, what they found was the impact was limited to people who had been friends before they started using Facebook, or that had met through other mechanisms and had vigorous relationships with one another beyond Facebook. And that people who simply declared themselves as a Facebook friend had no influence on others. So if you go home and you check your Facebook account and somebody has unfriended you, please do not be devastated by that, unless it's your mother. Folks, we are wired from the very beginning as human beings to be empathetic. We are designed to be social creatures. Think about this. You're on the African savanna. You're not the fastest creature. There are days I wonder whether we were even the smartest. But somehow, humans managed to survive in quite a hostile environment. How did they do it? Well, one of the big reasons is they learned to work together. They learn to communicate with each other through things like nonverbal methods, particularly facial expressions. It's so important that we now know that there are very specific parts of the brain whose entire function is dedicated to the recognition of faces and helping us understand those faces. And if you want to do a little experiment sometime, and you see a new infant baby who's literally moments old, if you bring them within focal range, which for a new infant is around 10 inches, and you manipulate your facial expression, you can raise or lower their heart rate if they're looking at you. This is not something that they get through experience. We refine that ability through experience, but they are born with the ability to recognize other human faces, and particularly emotional aspects of faces. Right? And in being able to recognize those faces, it has a particular purpose, which is to help us develop deep connections with one another. So no surprise, a group of neuroscientists undertook some research a little while ago, and there's something called Neuro Synchronization that occurs. It's a fancy way of saying we connect with one another. You know how when you meet somebody and they just seem to get you and you get them? That's sort of the exemplar of synchronization. But in this case, it's in a neurological sense. You know, your neurons are firing and they're going, hey, that neuron, I get along well with that one. Right? So it turns out that when we looked at various kinds of communication with people, that no surprise, face-to-face communication overwhelmingly produced the greatest neurosynchronization in the brain. And that was followed then by video chat and then telephone, and finally very little occurred through the use of social media. Several studies have found higher connectedness leads to less emotional distress, anxiety, depression. This was recently demonstrated in a longitudinal study, an excellent study in New Zealand. In other words, the more connected you are, it predicts your ability to be happier and ultimately healthier. Okay? This, by the way, is a photograph from New Zealand, taken from their perspective. Having spent time in New Zealand, I can tell you that every Kiwi in the room would just be bursting out with laughter at this point, because they would say this is how they view Canadians. Because if you go to New Zealand and you look and you see their maps, New Zealand is at the top of the world. Come back for an additional lecture about a discussion about why that is not an improbability. So people who have high levels of connection with one another are less lonely and 50% less likely to die prematurely. In this particular study's case, dying before age 70. As I approach 70, that doesn't seem like premature death at all to me, but that's another issue. Okay? Put another way, if you're lonely, that's equivalent in terms of risk for chronic disease to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness kills. By comparison, remember, 50% increase if you're obese, which, and everyone's talking about obesity around, and this is not to undermine the importance of us thinking about this as a risk factor for health and well-being, but its additional risk for premature death is only 30%, less than loneliness. The irony, of course, is that loneliness also is related to the risk of obesity. Okay? Lonely people are 30% more likely to have a heart attack, and we know the reason for it. One of the primary reasons is that going back to when we were developing as human beings, it turns out that when you're on the savannah and there are lions and hippos and alligators and all kinds of things that want to kill you, maim you, and eat you, that being on your own is a very scary thing. And so the kind of fight or flight response kicks in. And in the modern world, the same thing continues to happen. And we know that a blood clotting protein called fibrinogen is dumped in to your bloodstream, which increases both the risk of a clot and ultimately increases inflammation, which in turn is related to cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, and so forth. So this is an interesting study. This is a study from Toronto, a simulation. So somebody wanted to know, well, what would happen if there was a 25% reduction in poverty? What would happen if there was a 75% improvement in the level of connectedness that we have with one another, or an 80% improvement in smoking and obesity rates, and a 70% improvement in persons who had proper housing? What would be the impact on chronic illness? And what you see is that despite the fact that we spend a lot of time talking about things like smoking and obesity, it has the potential in this particular model to reduce the number of persons suffering from chronic illness between 25 and 64 by 12,000, but reducing loneliness, improving human connection, has 5 times the impact. So in the words of Marvin Gaye, and I won't sing for you, but hey, what's going on? Well, social media may reduce our ability to empathize. And it does so because it restricts the depth and richness of our communications, the things that allow us to reach out and literally understand and resonate with another human being, not just communicate. It's the difference between talking to an adolescent who has just awoken from the silver slumber first thing in the morning before breakfast, when you say, hey, how are you? And you get, versus, say, 9 o'clock at night when they're ready to go out and have a good time, in which case then they want to have a discussion, and your response is, Technology also makes our physical location less important, which reduces our ability to exchange stories in a fully emotive way. Yes, we can tell stories online, but what do we love? What do little children love more than anything? If my children are indicative, what do they love? What do they ask for at bedtime? A story. My father, by the way, was the world's greatest storyteller. Somebody said they could see that. Yeah. By the way, I also inherited another trait of his, which is that I just talk and talk and talk. Why are things like stories and empathy important? What about job loss and the sense of violation of fairness and reciprocity? Right? Well, it turns out that all of those things are fundamental to our very humanity. An anthropologist in 1971 wanted to know, are there certain characteristics that appear in every single culture and society on the planet? And turns out there are. Very limited number of things. All societies recognize the importance and are built around empathy. All societies tell stories. All societies value reciprocity, fairness, and generosity. All societies have various forms of artistic expression that include dance, fine art, and music. Every society have leaders. They are fundamental, in other words, to our very nature as human beings. And so, I worry about what's going on. Okay. How many people here believe that social media and smartphones improve our ability to communicate with family and friends? Hands up. Yeah. It's not unreasonable. How many believe that it improves our ability to make new friends? Hands up. How many people believe that it reduces rather than that it reduces loneliness? How many people think it might exacerbate loneliness? Yeah. And therefore, how many people believe that technology could be, if we're not paying attention, detrimental to our health and well-being? Yeah. Okay. Well, what can we do about it, folks? Well, I'm going to throw just a handful of things for your consideration. We need to increase awareness that technology has consequences to health and humanity. Yep, they got economic benefits, but we need to do a full cost analysis about what's really happening and the price that we are about to pay. We are engaged in the world's largest single natural experiment, and we have no idea how it's going to turn out. That's a big gamble. So we need to think twice about the use of technology in healthcare, education, social services, and workplace. I'm not convinced that asking our students to spend more time online in healthcare courses is a good thing when the foundation of good care is being able to connect, to develop empathic skills. And if we're inhibiting their ability to develop those skills, I'm not sure we're doing the right thing. I think that many of the assumptions that we make are either incorrect or untested. And the time has come to start thinking about placing limits on the use of certain kinds of technology. Our faculty is actively thinking about right now how we might be able to do this and the expectations that we have of one another. And establishing policies in all kinds of places, home as well as workplaces. I wouldn't be a researcher if I didn't say this. You know, like I'd be thrown out of academia if I didn't say that we need more research. There are some longitudinal analyses that are starting to appear, but most of the work that we have is correlational. And so all of the critics of what I'm telling you today will jump in very quickly and say, that's all correlational. You can't demonstrate causality. Yeah, I heard that same argument 40 years ago about cigarettes, folks. And while we were screwing around trying to get longitudinal studies, 500 million people died. I don't want to see that ever again in my lifetime. We need to help build skills around empathy and storytelling. And these are things that can be taught, right? They're skills, not traits. And maybe it's time to hold the industry accountable about making their products purposefully addictive. And to that end, don't underestimate the incredible political influence of big tech firms. Did you know that Apple and Google and Amazon are now the 3 largest, most well-funded advocacy groups in the United States? Did you know, by the way, that Facebook and Google both have political consulting arms? And for a price, they will tell you how to win an election. And you can have access to their exclusive data that they have collected courtesy of you. You need to get a handle on it, and fast. So, let's not get carried away with all of the economic things. That technology is not a cure for every ill. It has some benefits that we need to acknowledge, and our challenge is to figure out how to live side by side with technology in a way that does not compromise our own health and well-being and very humanity. So if you want to know a little bit more, there's a couple of books Alone Together by Sherry Turkle is excellent. Another one that I just love, Jeff Colvin, called Humans Are Underrated. Now, I don't know where you're at, but thanks. I've had just about as much of myself as I can take. So I'm going to stop there.